There are moments in a sports season that crystallize everything. Everything that has been building, everything that has been suspected, everything that critics have been warning about and supporters have been desperately hoping would not materialize. It all arrives in a single game, compressed and concentrated into 40 minutes of regulation and however many brutal minutes overtime demands.
Clark backing up and dropping a three. Rookie out of Australia. Here is Clark. Oh, yeah! Here from Indianapolis, Caitlin Clark sends us to overtime because Sonia Citron.
The Indiana Fever versus Washington Mystics game was unquestionably one of those moments. And we need to examine it with the kind of unflinching honesty that the situation demands, because what happened in that building contains both the most thrilling individual performance this league has produced in years and one of the most glaring organizational failures that has been visible to the naked eye across this entire early stretch of the season. We begin with Caitlin Clark, because to start anywhere else would be a fundamental disservice to what she put on display. 32 points, 8 assists, 4 rebounds, 2 steals, a block, 10 of 26 from the field overall, and that field goal percentage will draw its predictable criticism until you understand the full context in which it was produced. With the logo bombs back in the arsenal, with the deep threes landing at the most critical moments, with the passes that make people genuinely stop what they are doing and reconsider what they are watching. In the fourth quarter of this game, Clark looked like the player the entire league was supposed to be built around. The thrill was back. Completely, undeniably, unmistakably back. Let that reality sit for a full moment before moving forward. Indiana was down 9 points entering the fourth quarter. The team was struggling to generate any kind of sustainable offensive rhythm. The momentum had been thoroughly surrendered across the second and third quarters. The coaching had produced no visible answers to what Washington was doing defensively and offensively, and Caitlin Clark looked at that situation, decided she had seen enough, elevated her competitive output to a level that defies straightforward categorization, and carried this team to overtime through sheer individual brilliance that this league has not seen in recent memory. Approximately 18 points in the fourth quarter alone. Pull-up threes from ranges that most professional players do not seriously attempt. Logo bombs, the signature deep-range artillery that makes Clark genuinely impossible to contain when it is firing at full capacity. The shot that sent this game to overtime. In that fourth quarter stretch, Clark was the complete, unrestricted, unfiltered version of the show, and it was as compelling as anything this sport has offered in years. And yet, the Indiana Fever lost in overtime. And that loss, that painful, deeply revealing, entirely avoidable loss, belongs to forces within this organization that must be confronted with directness and without the protective cushion of polite diplomatic framing. We have to go back to the first quarter. That is where this game was fundamentally shaped. That is where the decisions that determined the final outcome were first made, and where the accountability for everything that followed must be assigned. Clark was rolling in the first quarter. She hit 2 consecutive three-pointers. She had generated 3 assists. The offense was actually clicking, genuinely, visibly clicking, in a way it had not managed to sustain through the early portion of this season. Indiana had built a lead in the range of 10 to 12 points. Given the trajectory of how Clark was playing, given the rhythm she had clearly found, given the momentum that was accumulating in Indiana's favor, that lead carried the very real possibility of expanding significantly before the quarter even concluded. Stephanie White pulled her out of the game. That single decision made at that specific moment, with Clark cooking and the lead growing and the offensive rhythm genuinely established for perhaps the first time all season, proved to be the turning point of the entire contest. Not Washington's talent differential, not the overtime execution, not anything the Mystics did strategically in the second or third quarters. The moment Caitlin Clark sat down on the bench in the first quarter while the game was moving decisively in Indiana's favor, everything that followed traces directly back to that one substitution. The Indiana Fever did not make a single field goal for 4 consecutive minutes after Clark came out. 4 minutes. Complete offensive paralysis. The 12-point lead evaporated entirely. By the time the damage was fully assessed and Clark was reinserted into the lineup, the margin had collapsed to a single point. The Washington Mystics had taken every ounce of momentum Indiana had built through Clark's performance, reversed it completely, and turned a comfortable advantage into a one-possession game, all while Clark sat on the bench watching the lead she had created disappear possession by possession. She came back into the game cold. The rhythm she had built was broken. Maintaining the offensive rhythm that Clark generates requires active participation in the flow of the game, continuous involvement, continuous read-making, continuous connection to the tempo, and the defensive adjustments happening in real time. A 4-minute bench stint at the precise moment she was playing her best basketball of the season destroyed that rhythm as thoroughly as any defensive scheme Washington could have deployed. And the second and third quarters reflected those consequences with brutal clarity. Clark struggled to find her shot. The offense generated nothing consistent. The Mystics dominated those 2 quarters systematically, while Indiana searched without success for the coherence that had briefly and brilliantly existed in the opening period. The fourth quarter, and the extraordinary performance Clark produced within it, was not the system working. Let that be stated plainly and without ambiguity. The fourth quarter was Clark overriding the system, bypassing its constraints, operating on pure competitive instinct and individual greatness to manufacture something spectacular out of a situation that coaching decisions had made desperately difficult. When she took control and operated without the limitations that had been placed on her game, the results were extraordinary. When she was operating within those constraints through the middle quarters, the results told an entirely different and far less encouraging story. Now we must address Kelsey Mitchell, because the accountability conversation cannot be complete without examining her performance with the same honest eye we apply everywhere else. Mitchell shot 10 of 25 from the field for 24 points. That is a substantial volume of attempts for that point total, and the inefficiency of that ratio represents one number within a broader statistical profile that is becoming an increasingly serious concern. For the second consecutive game, Mitchell did not record a single assist, not one. She did not record a single rebound, not one. In the minutes she played as a primary offensive option, receiving deliberate and designed shot opportunities within this team's offensive structure, Mitchell contributed exclusively through attempted field goals, and even that primary contribution collapsed at the moments when it mattered most. In overtime, with Indiana having a genuine opportunity to take the lead, Mitchell missed a wide-open layup, not a contested shot, not a difficult angle under defensive pressure, a wide-open layup, and then, standing at the free throw line with the opportunity to cut the deficit to a single possession, she missed both attempts, both free throws. In a game ultimately decided by the thinnest margin, those execution failures in overtime represent the direct, measurable difference between a loss and a victory. Every other rotation player on this team has recorded assists during these early games. Monique Billings found teammates. Sophie Cunningham found teammates. Maisha Hines-Allen recorded 5 assists in this very game. Lexi Hall found a way to contribute one. Aaliyah Boston contributed before her injury. Kelsey Mitchell, operating as a primary offensive option in 2 consecutive games with significant minutes at the 2-guard position, has not recorded a single assist across that entire span. Not one look to a cutting teammate. Not one drive and kick completion that resulted in a basket. Not one possession where the decision to pass produced a better outcome than the decision to shoot. This is not a minor statistical variance that evens out over a larger sample. This is a player operating in an exclusively self-contained scoring mode, regardless of what the defense is presenting, regardless of what teammates are doing in the spaces around her, and regardless of whether a simple pass to an open teammate would produce a higher percentage outcome than a contested individual attempt. For a player receiving the kind of offensive opportunities and financial commitment that Mitchell is receiving, the complete absence of playmaking contribution across consecutive games demands organizational accountability that this front office has not yet been willing to provide publicly. Now we need to confront the Aaliyah Boston injury directly because it represents the organizational chickens arriving home to roost in the most visible and consequential way possible. Boston suffered a lower leg injury during this game and did not return. She came into this season already managing physical concerns and has now been further compromised at a point when the team can least afford it. The duration of her absence is uncertain, but the implications are immediate and severe. Indiana is now staring at a front court depth crisis that was entirely predictable and was, in fact, predicted repeatedly by observers who questioned the roster construction decisions made before this season began. The team signed multiple guards in the offseason. The front court depth was never adequately addressed. The backup big situation entering this season was consistently flagged as insufficient. Those concerns were dismissed by organizational decision-makers at the time. Now, with Boston potentially unavailable for an extended stretch, Indiana is left relying on Monique Billings and Misha Hines-Allen as their primary interior options. And while both players bring genuine effort and certain capabilities, neither provides the defensive presence, the rebounding authority, or the rim protection that a legitimate backup big needs to deliver when the starting center cannot play. Washington exposed this vulnerability comprehensively. The Mystics went 3 bigs deep in their rotation and physically dominated Indiana's interior throughout the second and third quarters of this game. When you lack the length to contest shots at the rim consistently and the bodies to match up physically in the rebounding battle, teams with genuine interior depth will punish you in the paint repeatedly. Washington did exactly that. Deirdre Dodd was identified before free agency even concluded as inadequate for the backup center role on a contending team. That identification was accurate, and now, with Boston's health in question, the consequences of those construction decisions will shape the competitive reality of the coming weeks in ways that the front office cannot deflect or minimize through organizational messaging. The front office was warned. The warnings were dismissed. The bill has now arrived. There is one more dimension of this game that cannot pass without direct examination, and it is perhaps the most revealing data point of the entire contest. In overtime, with the game on the line and the decisive possession determining whether Indiana went home with a win or a loss, the ball was not in Caitlin Clark's hands. Sit with that for a moment and consider what it means. Clark had just delivered the most electric fourth-quarter performance this franchise has witnessed this season. She had personally generated the points that made overtime possible. She was the player who had demonstrated in real time across 9 minutes of the fourth quarter that she was operating at the highest individual level of anyone on that floor. She is the most dangerous offensive player on this roster by every measurable standard available. And the final possession of overtime, the moment that separated the win column from the loss column, was not designed to put the basketball in her hands. There is no tactical framework, no defensive scheme consideration, no situational basketball logic that reasonably produces the conclusion that Caitlin Clark is not the optimal choice to have the ball with a game on the line in overtime. Whatever explanation exists for that decision, it reflects something about the organizational hierarchy of trust and the coaching philosophy at work within this franchise that the fan base and the analytical community are fully, completely, and justifiably alarmed by. The game is over. The overtime result is permanent. But what produced that result, The first quarter substitution that broke a 12-point lead into a 1-point deficit in 4 scoreless minutes, 2 consecutive games without a single assist from a player receiving maximum offensive opportunities, and significant financial investment, a roster that was not adequately constructed to absorb the loss of its starting center, and a final overtime possession that bypassed the best player on the floor. That accounting does not end when the final buzzer sounds. It accumulates. Caitlin Clark's fourth quarter performance in this game was the most electric, sustained individual display this league has produced in recent seasons. The logo bombs were back. The vision was operating at full capacity. The competitive intensity and shot-making brilliance that make her the greatest commercial and competitive draw in women's professional basketball were fully present. And every bit of it was very nearly enough to overcome everything the coaching and roster construction had placed in its path. Very nearly is not enough when you lose in overtime by a margin that the individual execution failures and substitution decisions created. And the distance between what Clark produced and what the final result required represents, completely and entirely, the organizational decisions that this franchise must reckon with honestly and urgently before this season defines itself in a direction that even a player of Clark's extraordinary ability cannot reverse alone. The season is still early. Boston's injury will determine significant portions of what comes next competitively. Adjustments are possible, corrections can be made, but the window for making those corrections without serious long-term consequences is not unlimited. And the pattern that has established itself through these opening games, visible, documented, and growing more pronounced with each passing contest, is telling a story that everyone paying attention can read clearly. The only question left is whether the people responsible for changing that story are reading it too.